I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped out of the rideshare and saw three movers in gray uniforms leaning against stacks of boxes on the sidewalk. My boxes. My handwriting. My labels, winter coats, client files, kitchen fragile, all in the same dark blue marker I kept in my desk drawer inside the penthouse I had left less than 10 days ago. For a second, I honestly thought Seattle had shifted into some alternate reality while I was sunbathing in the Caribbean. Maybe someone else used the same color marker. Maybe another unit was moving out. Maybe I was sleep-deprived or jet-lagged. Maybe anything except the truth rising inside my chest like a tidal wave. One of the movers lifted his clipboard and squinted at me. "You Lauren Hale?" My throat felt dry as salt. "Yes." He nodded as if he were confirming a pizza order. "We were told to clear out your penthouse. New owner gets the keys today. New owner. Keys. Today." The street noise faded. The drizzle, the rumble of buses, the people walking around me, it all blurred. My lungs pulled in air that didn't feel like air at all. Something inside me cracked open and froze at the same time. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother: "Don't make a scene. It's done. Your sister needed help." Then another bubble appeared so fast I barely blinked between the two. "Welcome home, homeless girl." I didn't know cruelty could fit so casually inside 3 words. I didn't know your own mother could hit you that precisely with the exact wound she created. And yet somehow I just stood there. And I smiled. Not out of humor, God, no. It was something else entirely. Something cold and sharp rising in my spine. My phone buzzed again, an incoming FaceTime call from my parents. I answered without thinking. Their faces filled the screen, my mother tight-lipped and impatient, my father already annoyed. "What's so funny?" my mother snapped. I looked at them and said quietly, "The apartment you sold was actually..." And just like that, panic flickered across both their faces. I let the call hang open for a second, then lowered the phone from my ear. I wasn't going to give them the answer. Not yet. I turned back toward the movers who were awkwardly waiting for instructions, probably wondering why a fully grown woman looked like she'd been hit by a truck. "Can you just give me a minute?" I asked. One of them nodded sympathetically. Rough day. If only he knew. I stepped away, gripping my suitcase handle so tightly my fingers ached. The Caribbean was still on my skin. The faint smell of coconut lotion, the warm ghost of sunlight, but none of it felt real anymore. That life on the beach might as well have been 5 years ago, not 5 hours back. I dialed my mother, she answered instantly. "You don't need to call," she said. "We already handled everything." "Why?" My voice came out thin. "Why would you do this?" "Because Paige was drowning," she said sharply. "She had gambling debts you know nothing about. She was in danger. You were off sipping cocktails. You don't need that penthouse, Lauren. You're one person. Paige needs stability." My father's voice chimed in stern and self-righteous. "Family comes first." "Family," I whispered. "You mean her?" My mother scoffed. "Don't start. You've always had more. You've always been the strong one. We assumed you wouldn't mind helping. You didn't ask. Well, you would have said no. Then that would have been my choice." Silence, sharp cold telling. Then my sister's voice slid into the call, sugary and sour all at once. "Lauren, you're being dramatic. You don't even like living in the city that much, and you travel all the time. You'll be fine." I needed help. Mom and Dad did what they had to. I swallowed hard. Paige used to cry on my shoulder at 14. Paige used to steal my sweaters and leave apology notes. Paige used to beg me to drive her to school when she overslept. That Paige felt like a ghost now. "Did any of you think for 1 second that maybe I needed my home?" I asked. My mother exhaled loudly. "Stop acting like the victim. We had the legal authority. You signed a power of attorney years ago when you had that surgery. Remember? That was for medical emergencies," I said. "Not real estate. We updated it," she said breezily. Cold prickled down my arms. "You updated my signature without me." My father cut in impatient. Lauren dropped the theatrics. You've always been emotional. There it was, the word, emotional. Their favorite weapon, their way of shrinking me into something small and unreasonable. I breathed in slowly. I'm done with this conversation. I hung up before they could spit another lie into my ear. I turned back toward the movers. My voice was steadier this time. Please put everything into storage. I'll give you an address later. They nodded and started loading boxes again. I stepped aside and pulled up my contacts list. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something else, something rising. I hadn't called Mason Ward in years. We met in college. He became an attorney, a good one. And more importantly, a principled one. I pressed dial. He answered on the second ring. Lauren, they sold my penthouse while I was in the Caribbean, I said. I need help. There was a beat of silence. Then Mason's voice hardened. Do not speak to them again, not one word. We need the trust documents. We're going to fix this. I exhaled for what felt like the first time since stepping out of the car. I'll head to a motel and send everything tonight. Good. And Lauren, stay calm. They messed up. The ride to the motel was a blur. The room smelled like bleach and stale air, a far cry from the jasmine and ocean breeze my penthouse always held. I sat on the stiff bed and opened my laptop. My reflection in the black screen didn't look like me. Or maybe it did, maybe it was the version of me I hadn't seen in years. The version who didn't shrink under their voices. I opened my encrypted vault. My grandmother Evelyn's trust documents were all there. PDFs carefully scanned years ago because she told me to always keep a digital copy. People can lose paper, she had said. But they can't lose the truth. The trust was simple, clear, unbreakable. Beneficiary, Lauren Jane Hale. Asset Penthouse at Harborview Tower. Restrictions asset cannot be sold, transferred, liquidated, or altered without explicit written consent and physical signature of the sole beneficiary. My heart thudded once hard. They had never had the right. Not for 1 second. Not with any signature, real or forged. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Relief and fury twisted together so tightly I couldn't pull them apart. My phone buzzed. A new message from Mason. Send the documents when you can. This changes everything. Try to rest. Rest. I didn't know if I could. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the thin pillow. Outside rain began tapping the window softly like fingers trying to pull me back to earth. I whispered into the dark room, into the space where my life had caved in and rebuilt itself in the same hour. They think they broke me, I said softly. They have no idea. And with that one truth settling in my chest like a spark refusing to die, I knew exactly who I was fighting for now. Me. The motel room was still dim when I woke, the kind of gray morning light that makes everything look heavier than it is. My head felt full, like my thoughts hadn't settled even after hours of lying awake. I sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep, or the lack of it, from my eyes. The air smelled like old carpet and disinfectant, and the thin blanket had slipped halfway off the bed, as if even it couldn't commit to staying here. For a moment I just sat there and let myself breathe. Really breathe. I wasn't waking up in my penthouse. I wasn't waking up to ocean-scented candles or the view of the harbor. I was waking up in a room I didn't choose because my family decided my home was theirs to liquidate like a used car, and yet underneath the exhaustion a quiet resolve thrummed. I picked up my phone. No new messages, thank God. I wasn't ready to sift through any more guilt-soaked voicemails or delusional justifications. I checked the time and dialed Mason. He answered before the first ring even finished. You okay? As okay as I can be in a motel that smells like expired lemons, I said. You send the trust documents, I'm about to. Good. The trust is our anchor. Let's start there. I opened my laptop, logged into the encrypted vault again, and sent the files to him. A beat later, a notification popped up. Mason had already opened them. His voice sharpened through the speaker. Lauren, This is exactly what I hoped for. The penthouse is fully protected under the Evelyn Hale Inheritance Trust. You are the only authorized signatory, no trustee, no co-beneficiary, no transfer rights without your signature. I leaned back in the creaking chair, staring at the ceiling. So they had zero authority, Zero, Mason said. What they did wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud. The word sent a cold thrill through me, something between fear and vindication. And Lauren, he added, did you ever sign an updated power of attorney? I shut my eyes. Never. Then we might have an additional problem, he said carefully. Your mother claiming there was an update. That suggests a forged document. We'll need to subpoena it. My stomach twisted. The idea of my signature, my identity being replicated by someone in my own family, made something inside me curl inward. Paige, I whispered. Mason didn't answer immediately, but his silence said enough. He cleared his throat. Look, before we dig deeper, there's something you need to understand. Your grandmother put safeties in this trust for a reason. I swallowed, my throat tightening at the mention of Evelyn. She always said she wanted to protect me, and she did, Mason replied. This trust was designed specifically to prevent exactly what happened. Images of my grandmother drifted into my mind, her hands warm around a mug of tea, the soft way she brushed my hair back when she told me stories, the lemon cookies she made every Sunday. She was gentle, but she was nobody's fool. She told me once, I murmured, that love and loyalty aren't always the same thing. I didn't understand what she meant back then. Now you do, Mason said. A quiet moment passed between us, long enough for me to feel the difference between grief and clarity. Okay, I finally said. What's next? We follow the money. His tone changed, professional, clinical. I straightened instinctively. I've looked into your recent bank records, he continued. There were multiple withdrawals under $300 over the past 12 months. I frowned. I thought those were random autopay charges. They weren't. Someone was siphoning small amounts to avoid the bank's fraud alerts. A chill rippled up my spine. My parents had access to my guest room. Paige had been borrowing my spare key for months. And I'd been traveling so much that I barely noticed anything. Lauren, Mason said gently, this was deliberate, and it started long before the sale. I pressed a hand against my forehead, trying to piece together the timeline. Paige said she was struggling, but she never said with what. Mason hesitated. I can tell you what we know so far. Your parents refinanced their home 3 months ago. They were already in financial trouble. I blinked. Why, I don't know yet. But I suspect it has to do with your sister's debts. Of course it did. Everything always circled back to Paige, her crisis, her mistakes, the endless vacuum of her needs. I loved her once so fiercely it hurt, but love didn't blind me anymore. I need to call the buyers, I said. Already arranged, Mason replied. They're willing to talk. They'll call you in an hour. I hung up and let myself slide back into the stiff chair. The motel's AC hummed loudly, filling the silence. My mind drifted back to the months before my trip. Paige's sudden expensive clothes, her cryptic texts, her random disappearances for weekends she couldn't explain. The way my parents whispered more. The way they shifted whenever I entered a room, like I was interrupting a conversation they didn't want me to hear. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was layered, slow, careful. And it wasn't just about the penthouse. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Hello, a man's voice, polite but strained. Hi, Lauren. This is Michael, my wife Dana, and I attempted to buy your penthouse. My pulse quickened. Thank you for calling. His exhale sounded like it had been held in for days. We owe you an apology. We always felt something was off. My throat tightened. What did my parents tell you? There was a pause, as if he didn't want to say it. Then he did anyway. They told us you were emotionally unstable, that contacting you would make things worse. I closed my eyes and let the words hit hard. Not because they surprised me, but because they fit too neatly into the narrative my parents had crafted for years. Dramatic, overreactive, fragile. Dana's voice joined the call, soft and embarrassed. We didn't know what to believe. They were very insistent, and your father was forceful. I steadied my breath. Did they show you a power of attorney? Yes, Dana said. It looked strange. Like the signature was stiff. My heart dropped. Paige. It had to be Paige. We saved copies, Michael added quickly. And all the emails. Emails. More proof. More lies documented in black and white. I'd like to look at those, I said. My attorney will reach out. Of course, Michael replied. We're so sorry. We never wanted to be part of anything fraudulent. After we hung up, I gripped the edge of the table until the cheap wood dug into my palms. Every revelation felt like a small explosion going off inside me, loud, hot, disorienting. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. Unknown number. Stop digging. I stared at it, my breath caught in my chest. No punctuation, no signature. Just a warning. Paige, my mother, my father. It didn't matter. They were scared. Good. I forwarded the message to Mason with one line, new development. Then I sat back on the bed, letting the thin motel walls hold my anger for me. The truth wasn't just unraveling, it was exploding outward. And I wasn't running from it. Not this time. An hour later, another call came. Nervous voice. Realtor Jade Bishop. Lauren, I'm so relieved you reached out. Your parents, they pushed me harder than any clients I've ever worked with. Something felt wrong. Her honesty was shaky but sincere. She described the rushed timeline, the pressure, the evasive answers when she asked about me. And then she said it, the sentence that tightened every muscle in my body. There's a security camera in the signing room. I pulled the footage. You need to see it. For a moment, everything inside me went still. Then I whispered, bring it. When I ended the call, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the beginning of something powerful. Evidence, truth, and the quiet burning promise that I was getting my life back. The motel room was still dim when I woke, the kind of gray morning light that makes everything look heavier than it is. My head felt full, like my thoughts hadn't settled even after hours of lying awake. I sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep or the lack of it from my eyes. The air smelled like old carpet and disinfectant, and the thin blanket had slipped halfway off the bed, as if even it couldn't commit to staying here. For a moment I just sat there and let myself breathe. Really breathe. I wasn't waking up in my penthouse. I wasn't waking up to ocean-scented candles or the view of the harbor. I was waking up in a room I didn't choose, because my family decided my home was theirs to liquidate like a used car. And yet underneath the exhaustion, a quiet resolve thrummed. I picked up my phone. No new messages, thank God. I wasn't ready to sift through any more guilt-soaked voicemails or delusional justifications. I checked the time and dialed Mason. He answered before the first ring even finished. You okay? As okay as I can be in a motel that smells like expired lemons, I said. You send the trust documents, I'm about to. Good. The trust is our anchor. Let's start there. I opened my laptop, logged into the encrypted vault again, and sent the files to him. A beat later, a notification popped up. Mason had already opened them. His voice sharpened through the speaker. Lauren, this is exactly what I hoped for. The penthouse is fully protected under the Evelyn Hale Inheritance Trust. You are the only authorized signatory, no trustee, no co-beneficiary, no transfer rights without your signature. I leaned back in the creaking chair, staring at the ceiling. So they had zero authority. Zero, Mason said. What they did wasn't a misunderstanding, it was fraud. The word sent a cold thrill through me, something between fear and vindication. And Lauren, he added, did you ever sign an updated power of attorney? I shut my eyes. Never. Then we might have an additional problem, he said carefully. Your mother claiming there was an update. That suggests a forged document. We'll need to subpoena it. My stomach twisted. The idea of my signature, my identity being replicated by someone in my own family, made something inside me curl inward. Paige, I whispered. Mason didn't answer immediately, but his silence said enough. He cleared his throat. Look, before we dig deeper, there's something you need to understand. Your grandmother put safeties in this trust for a reason. I swallowed, my throat tightening at the mention of Evelyn. She always said she wanted to protect me. And she did, Mason replied. This trust was designed specifically to prevent exactly what happened. Images of my grandmother drifted into my mind. Her hands warm around a mug of tea, the soft way she brushed my hair back, when she told me stories, the lemon cookies she made every Sunday. She was gentle, but she was nobody's fool. She told me once, I murmured, that love and loyalty aren't always the same thing. I didn't understand what she meant back then. Now you do, Mason said. A quiet moment passed between us, long enough for me to feel the difference between grief and clarity. Okay, I finally said. What's next? We follow the money. His tone changed, professional, clinical. I straightened instinctively. I've looked into your recent bank records, he continued. There were multiple withdrawals under $300 over the past 12 months. I frowned. I thought those were random autopay charges. They weren't. Someone was siphoning small amounts to avoid the bank's fraud alerts. A chill rippled up my spine. My parents had access to my guest room. Paige had been borrowing my spare key for months, and I'd been traveling so much that I barely noticed anything. Lauren, Mason said gently, this was deliberate. And it started long before the sale. I pressed a hand against my forehead, trying to piece together the timeline. Paige said she was struggling. But she never said with what. Mason hesitated. I can tell you what we know so far. Your parents refinanced their home 3 months ago. They were already in financial trouble. I blinked. Why, I don't know yet. But I suspect it has to do with your sister's debts. Of course it did. Everything always circled back to Paige, her crisis, her mistakes, the endless vacuum of her needs. I loved her once so fiercely it hurt. But love didn't blind me anymore. I need to call the buyers, I said. Already arranged, Mason replied. They're willing to talk. They'll call you in an hour. I hung up and let myself slide back into the stiff chair. The motel's AC hummed loudly, filling the silence. My mind drifted back to the months before my trip. Paige's sudden expensive clothes, her cryptic texts, her random disappearances for weekends she couldn't explain. The way my parents whispered more. The way they shifted whenever I entered a room, like I was interrupting a conversation they didn't want me to hear. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was layered, slow, careful. And it wasn't just about the penthouse. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Hello, a man's voice, polite but strained. Hi, Lauren. This is Michael. My wife, Dana, and I attempted to buy your penthouse. My pulse quickened. Thank you for calling. His exhale sounded like it had been held in for days. We owe you an apology. We always felt something was off. My throat tightened. What did my parents tell you? There was a pause, as if he didn't want to say it. Then he did anyway. They told us you were emotionally unstable, that contacting you would make things worse. I closed my eyes and let the words hit hard. Not because they surprised me, but because they fit too neatly into the narrative my parents had crafted for years. Dramatic, overreactive, fragile. Dana's voice joined the call, soft and embarrassed. We didn't know what to believe. They were very insistent. And your father was forceful. I steadied my breath. Did they show you a power of attorney? Yes, Dana said. It looked strange. Like the signature was stiff. My heart dropped. Paige. It had to be Paige. We saved copies, Michael added quickly. And all the emails. Emails. More proof. More lies documented in black and white. I'd like to look at those, I said. My attorney will reach out. Of course, Michael replied. We're so sorry. We never wanted to be part of anything fraudulent. After we hung up, I gripped the edge of the table until the cheap wood dug into my palms. Every revelation felt like a small explosion going off inside me, loud, hot, disorienting. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. Unknown number. Stop digging. I stared at it, my breath caught in my chest. No punctuation. No signature. Just a warning. Paige, my mother, my father. It didn't matter. They were scared. Good. I forwarded the message to Mason with one line: new development. Then I sat back on the bed, letting the thin motel walls hold my anger for me. The truth wasn't just unraveling, it was exploding outward, and I wasn't running from it, not this time. An hour later, another call came. Nervous voice. Realtor, Jade Bishop. Lauren, I'm so relieved you reached out. Your parents, they pushed me harder than any clients I've ever worked with. Something felt wrong. Her honesty was shaky but sincere. She described the rushed timeline, the pressure, the evasive answers when she asked about me. And then she said the sentence that tightened every muscle in my body. There's a security camera in the signing room. I pulled the footage. You need to see it. For a moment, everything inside me went still. Then I whispered, bring it. When I ended the call, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the beginning of something powerful. Evidence, truth, and the quiet burning promise that I was getting my life back. I stood outside the Hale family house, longer than I meant to, staring at the brick exterior that once felt warm and familiar. Now it looked smaller, older, almost shrunken under the weight of everything I'd learned. The shrubs were overgrown, the porch light flickered, and a thin foreclosure notice was tucked halfway under the welcome mat, like the house itself was ashamed to show it. The sky hung low and gray, Seattle's typical mood, but today it matched mine too perfectly. I exhaled once, steadied myself, and knocked. The door flew open so fast it slammed into the wall behind it. My father's face filled the framed jaw, clenched eyes already furious. Get inside, he snapped. I stepped in, staying near the doorway. The living room looked exactly the same as when I was a teenager, soft beige couches, crowded bookshelves, picture frames on every wall. But it all felt staged now. Like a set built to mimic a family we had never really been. My mother appeared from the kitchen holding a mug she clearly wasn't drinking from her fingers. We're trembling too hard for that. We need to talk, she said sharply. Paige sat curled on the couch, arms crossed, legs tucked under her, scrolling on her phone with the energy of someone pretending not to care. What do you want to talk about? I asked. My father closed the door behind me with a thud. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded. Filing complaints, threatening lawyers, freezing accounts. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're causing? I met his glare evenly. I'm undoing what you did. My mother stepped forward, voice coated in that syrupy tone she used whenever she pretended to be reasonable. Lauren, sweetheart, you're blowing this out of proportion. Yes, we handled things badly, but we were helping Paige. I laughed once, quiet, humorless. Helping her by stealing from me? Paige rolled her eyes. Here we go. You're so dramatic. You don't even need the penthouse. I need a home, I said. A home you sold behind my back. It's not selling, my mother snapped. It's reallocating within the family. Is that what you told the buyers? I asked. Or did you stick with the story that I'm mentally unstable? My mother's face drained. Paige stopped scrolling. My father's shoulders stiffened. I didn't say, my mother began. You did, I cut in. I saw the emails. For a second, nobody moved. Even the house seemed to freeze. You're twisting things, my father said. Lawyers manipulate evidence. You know how this works. That footage wasn't manipulated, I said. You stood there, all three of you. You watched Paige forge my signature. Paige stiffened. That video was taken out of context. There's not a single piece of context, I said calmly, that makes forging someone's signature okay. My mother's voice cracked. We only did what we did because we love you. That's not love, I replied. That's control. My father stepped toward me, his voice rising. Your sister was going to lose everything. She could have gotten hurt. You have money. You were supposed to help. You didn't ask, I said. You would have said no, he shot back. That was my right. Silence. Paige let out a scoff. God, you're impossible. You always act so superior. You have a fancy job, a luxury apartment. A penthouse, my mother corrected. Yes, Mom, a penthouse. Paige snapped, annoyed at even her correction. She always has everything. I don't see why it's too much for her to help her own family. I stared at her. Helping isn't the same as sacrificing my entire life. You weren't using it properly, my mother muttered. I blinked slowly. Excuse me. You travel so much, she said, voice gaining momentum. You barely live there. It's wasted on you. Paige needs stability. There was the truth. Not even hidden, just dressed in entitlement. I took a step forward. Let me be very clear. You don't get to decide what I need. You don't get to decide what I use or don't use. And you absolutely don't get to decide what belongs to me. Paige huffed. You're so selfish. I smiled softly. And you're so used to taking. My mother's voice broke. This is tearing us apart. No, I said. Forging documents tore us apart. Behind me, my father slammed his palm onto the counter. That's enough. You're going to drop this case. Today. You're not dragging your family through court. No, I said simply. He stepped closer, looming the way he always did when he wanted me small. But I didn't shrink. Not this time. Lauren, he growled, you don't have a choice. Yes, I said I do. My mother's eyes were glassy, desperate. Lauren, please. Be reasonable. We're your parents. And that's supposed to excuse everything I asked. You think being my parents means you own me, that you own my property. My money. My decisions. Paige jumped in, her voice rising. We didn't steal from you, we borrowed. I turned to her. A forged signature isn't borrowing. She opened her mouth, shut it again, her jaw clenching. My mother wiped her eyes quickly. We never meant to hurt you. You meant to use me, I said quietly. Then almost exactly on cue, she slipped. We updated the power of attorney because you weren't handling things properly. The room went still. I tilted my head. Updated without me, she stammered. We thought you wouldn't mind. You forged the update, I said. My mother looked at my father. He looked at Paige. Paige stared at the carpet. None of them said a word. I reached into my bag, pulled out the envelope Mason had prepared, and set it on the coffee table with a soft thud. What's that? My father demanded. Notice of legal action, I said. The injunction hearing is scheduled. My mother's face drained. Lauren, don't. Please don't do this. It's already done. You'll ruin us? She cried. No, I said calmly. You ruined yourselves. Paige stood abruptly. Over an apartment. Seriously, over betrayal, I said. My father pointed a trembling finger at me. If you walk out that door, don't come back. I held his gaze steadily. I was never welcome unless I was useful. My mother lunged toward me, but I stepped aside, walked to the front door, and opened it. The daylight outside spilled into the room, cleaner, brighter, honest. Behind me, voices rose. Anger, fear, denial, but none of it touched me anymore. I stepped onto the porch, closed the door behind me, and let the noise disappear like smoke in the wind. The air felt different, lighter. Not because the storm was over, but because I'd finally stepped out of it. And as I walked down the front steps toward my car, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. They had taken everything they thought made me weak. But all they really did was show me how strong I could be. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I stepped into Mason's office again. The air inside felt different from the hallway, cooler, steadier, like the room itself understood the weight of what was happening. I clutched my folder of documents a little too tightly, fingers denting the cardboard edges, as if I could anchor myself through pressure alone. Mason stood near the conference table sleeves, rolled up files spread out in neat rows. When he looked up, his expression shifted, half concern, half focus. You look like you just walked through a war zone, he said. I did, I answered. My family's house. He nodded once, not asking for details yet. Good, we'll unpack it all. But first, sit. We have work to do. Dr. Colleen Avery and Dr. Havers were already there, the same seats as yesterday, as if they hadn't left. The screens were lit, spreadsheets already waiting. There was something comforting about their professionalism, the way they treated my pain like a solvable equation instead of a personal flaw. I sank into the chair, exhaled slowly, and braced myself. Dr. Avery adjusted her glasses and opened a new tab. Lauren, she said gently, I've completed the first phase of the financial analysis. I felt my pulse thrum steady, heavy. Okay. What did you find? She projected a large spreadsheet onto the wall, columns of numbers, cascading down in alternating shades of gray and blue. At first glance, it looked like chaos. Then patterns began to emerge, clusters, peaks, strange repetitions. These, she said, highlighting a series of entries, are withdrawals from your account. All under $300. Consistent enough to form a pattern, inconsistent enough to avoid scrutiny. How far back does it go? I whispered. 12 months. My stomach twisted. 12 months of quiet, careful draining, death by 1,000 cuts. Your parents were hiding their financial deterioration for at least a year, Dr. Avery continued. And they were using your money to stay afloat. I swallowed hard, tasting metallic adrenaline. Why? She clicked to a new slide. Because your sister's gambling debts weren't just bad, she said. They were catastrophic. The next page displayed a figure so large, I actually blinked to make sure it wasn't a formatting error. Over $70,000 owed to 2 gambling platforms, she explained. Another $20,000 to a predatory lender with a 24% interest rate. 24%. I felt something inside me tilt. They said they did this to save her, I murmured. Dr. Avery nodded. But they weren't saving her. They were enabling her. And when they ran out of ways to cover her debts, they turned to you. My chest tightened. They always turned to me. She clicked again, revealing another cluster of transactions, this time in red. This, she said, is a second mortgage they took out on their home. They've been making minimum payments using your account transfers again without your knowledge. I closed my eyes. They would have lost the house. Yes, she said softly. They were approaching foreclosure. That explained the foreclosure notice sticking out of the welcome mat like a warning they didn't want me to see. Mason leaned forward. Your parents weren't honest about Paige's situation or their own. They weren't helping her. They were drowning with her, and they decided your home was going to be the life raft. A small sound escaped me, not quite a laugh, not even a gasp, more like the body recognizing a truth before the mind could process it. They planned it, I whispered. This wasn't desperation. It was strategy. And it gets worse, Dr. Avery added gently. She clicked to another screen, a single account summary labeled Family Emergency Fund. Except every deposit was from me, every withdrawal was to them, all contributions were siphoned from your savings, she explained. Not $1 came from your parents' accounts. My throat felt tight, the kind of tight that comes from anger buried too long. They made me think we all contributed to that account. They made you think a lot of things. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred into static. The betrayal was layered, thoughtful, intentional, rehearsed. Not one lapse, not one mistake. A pattern built brick by brick. A knock sounded at the door. Mason's paralegal stepped inside, holding a folder. Sorry, this just came in. You need to see it. She placed it in front of him, and Mason flipped it open. His eyes hardened. What is it? I asked. A credit union account, he said. In Paige's name, but with your address and financial information attached. I felt sick. Identity misuse. Identity fraud, Mason corrected. Another charge to add. The room felt smaller suddenly. My vision sharpened, the edges too crisp. Paige had used my credit information the way someone might borrow a sweater, casually entitled without hesitation. Then Mason's phone buzzed. He answered, listened for a few seconds, then looked at me with a colder expression than I'd ever seen on his face. "That was your bank," he said. "They detected suspicious activity on one of your accounts." My heart kicked hard. "What kind of activity?" "A withdrawal attempt," he said. "A large one," I inhaled sharply. "They're still doing it. They're panicking," Mason said. "That's good for us. Good." The word crashed against the chaos inside me like a lifeline. He placed the phone down carefully. "Lauren, they see the walls closing in. They're desperate. That means their mistakes will multiply." Dr. Avery nodded. "And desperation always leaves a trail." Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A flat, unsteady voice spoke. "You need to stop. You're going to regret this if you keep pushing." My breath caught. "Who is this?" Click. Silence. I lowered the phone slowly. "Well," I said, my voice steady even as my pulse raced, "that answers one question." Mason's jaw tightened. "Forward it to me. Threats only make your case stronger." I did. Immediately. He turned to Dr. Avery and Dr. Havers. "Let's continue." Dr. Avery resumed the analysis, pulling up a timeline she constructed 10 months of transactions, cross-checked with my travel dates, work trips, and financial statements. Every line of data screamed one truth. My parents had been draining me long before the Penthouse sale. This wasn't a moment of panic, she said. It was a long-term pattern of financial abuse. I stared at the timeline, at the steady erosion of my bank balance, my stability, my life, until something inside me clicked. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't grief. It was resolve. "They used my trust," I said quietly. "They used my silence, my loyalty. And they thought I'd keep letting them." Mason nodded. "You won't." "No," I said. "I won't." He slid a document toward me. "This authorizes me to file the injunction tomorrow. Once you sign it, they can't touch another cent." My hand didn't shake as I picked up the pen, not even a little. I signed. When it was done, Mason gathered the papers with a satisfied nod. "Good. Tomorrow morning we take the first real swing." I stood slowly, feeling steadier than I had in days. Not because I wasn't hurt, not because I wasn't betrayed, but because now I had the truth sharper than any lie they'd thrown at me. As I left the conference room, I paused at the door and looked back at all the evidence spread across the table: numbers, signatures, screenshots, timelines. My family had built their safety on my destruction, but I wasn't the daughter who stayed quiet anymore. I walked out into the cool Seattle evening, lifted my chin to the drizzle and whispered to myself, "They think they've backed me into a corner. They have no idea what happens when I stop stepping back." The sky was already bruising with late afternoon gray when I pulled back into the motel parking lot, but I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Not yet. My body was humming with leftover adrenaline from the confrontation at my parents' house, my mother's frantic, pleading, my father's threats, Paige's resentment dripping from every word. I sat in the car until my hands stopped shaking, then finally forced myself to step back into the wind and drive across town toward Mason's office. By the time I walked into the building's lobby, I felt hollow, but the kind of hollow that makes room for something stronger. Mason was already standing in the doorway of the long conference room when I arrived, his eyes' sharp expression taking in every detail of my posture. "You saw them," he said quietly. I nodded, closing the door behind me. "And they were exactly who I knew they'd be." He motioned me inside. "Sit. Tell me everything." I sat, folding my hands tightly in my lap, as I relayed the confrontation, the screaming, the denial, the theatrics, the moment my mother slipped and admitted they'd updated the power of attorney behind my back. Mason didn't interrupt once. His jaw only tightened slightly when I repeated my father's threat, and again when I described Paige's excuses. When I finished, Mason leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen twice on the table. "Everything they said today confirms the pattern of coercion we already suspected." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. So, I'm not crazy. He shook his head. Not even close. They gaslit you for years. Today was just the finale. The door opened then, and Dr. Havers stepped in carrying a slim laptop and a stack of printed exhibits. Ready for round 2, he asked? I managed a small nod. He placed 2 pages in front of me. This is your real signature. And this, he said, sliding another one next to it, is the forged signature used on the real estate documents. Even without the magnifier, the differences were obvious. My real signature flowed. The forgery trembled. They didn't even try to hide it, I whispered. That's the thing about people who believe they'll never face consequences, Mason said. They get sloppy. The door opened again. This time it was Dr. Avery, her laptop tucked under one arm, a paper coffee cup in her hand. Lauren, she greeted softly. I've got more findings. Of course she did. This nightmare had layers. We all sat as Dr. Avery connected her laptop to the big screen. The spreadsheets I'd seen yesterday were nothing compared to what she pulled up now. Here, she said, highlighting a series of large withdrawals, are the payments to a Nevada-based attorney. I blinked. Attorney. For gambling debt negotiation, Dr. Avery explained. Your parents were working with him for months. My chest tightened. They told everyone. Paige had medical issues. They lied, she said. To everyone. My throat felt like it was closing. So they were covering her debts by draining me, yes, Dr. Avery said. And when that wasn't enough, they moved to the penthouse. A numbness spread through my body. A cold, steady kind. Before I could process it, Dr. Avery clicked onto another screen, a new discovery. These are hidden accounts, she said. My pulse faltered. How many? 3? She opened the first one labeled Family Support, the same account they'd always claimed we all contributed to. Except the deposits were mine. Only mine. The withdrawals always my parents or Paige. This, I began, voice cracking, this is theft. Systematic, Dr. Avery said gently. She clicked open the second hidden account, gambling transactions, predatory loan payments, cash transfers to anonymous usernames. The third account was even worse. Paige had opened a line of credit using my identity, my address, my credit history. I felt sick. She really... Yes, Mason said. She did. Silence pulsed through the room like a heartbeat, then suddenly a sharp buzzing. My phone. Unknown number, I answered without thinking. A cold voice, familiar but not enough to identify. You need to stop before someone gets hurt. My stomach dropped. Who is this? I demanded. The line clicked dead. I stared at the screen, pulse thudding in my ears. Threat, Mason asked. I nodded, forwarding the voicemail to him instantly. They're scared. He picked up the paper I'd signed the day before. Good. Fear makes people sloppy. And sloppy people make mistakes. He set the paper down. Let's keep going. He turned to Dr. Avery. Trace every debt, every account, every transfer. I want 0 gaps. Then to Dr. Havers. Prepare the full forgery report. We'll need it for the injunction hearing. Then to me. And you, Lauren, need to prepare for emotional fallout. My voice felt too thin. They're going to try to break me. They're going to try, he corrected. But you won't let them, I swallowed. I'm trying, he shook his head. You're doing. There's a difference. Before I could respond, the reception desk outside rang twice. Footsteps came down the hallway, and the door pushed open just enough for Mason's paralegal to poke her head inside. There's someone here to see you, she said. We all tensed. Who? Mason asked. Realtor Jade Bishop, she replied. She brought more documents. Send her in, Mason said. Jade entered, her hands shaking slightly as she carried a thick folder. She set it down on the table. This is... Everything, she said, voice trembling. Emails, text logs, timestamps. Your parents told me not to contact you. They said you'd have a breakdown. They said I was unstable, too emotional, too dramatic. The narrative they'd repeated my entire life sharpened into a weapon. Mason flipped through the stack. His eyebrows rose. "This is excellent documentation," Jade's voice cracked. I didn't know they were lying, but when I saw the footage, I realized I'd been used. "You're helping now," I said. "That matters." She nodded gratefully and left. When the door closed, the room felt heavier but also sharper, like everything was falling into place. "This," Mason said, gesturing to the mountain of evidence on the table, "is what winning looks like." I stared at the papers, the numbers, the signatures, the threats, the lies, and for the first time since stepping off that plane from the Caribbean, I felt something strong rise inside me. Not rage, not grief. Something cleaner. Colder, sharper, resolve. I stood picking up the copy of my grandmother's trust. Evelyn's words echoed in my memory the last time she visited Seattle, her hand on mine, her voice steady. "Protect yourself, Lauren. Your heart is big, but theirs is not." I hadn't understood her then. Now I did. "Let's do this," I said. Mason nodded. "Tomorrow morning the injunction hearing begins." And as I walked out of the conference room, the Seattle wind hit my face, stinging but honest, and I knew without any hesitation my family had no idea what kind of fight they had started. But they were about to learn. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the signing room footage replayed behind my eyelids, Paige gripping the pen, my mother whispering in her ear, my father tapping the table like a drum of command. By the time morning finally bled through the motel curtains, my head felt thick, but my mind was sharp. Too sharp. I showered, quickly tied my hair back, and stared at myself in the mirror. I didn't look weak. I didn't look broken. I looked carved out, like someone who'd shed a layer of skin she never needed in the first place. I dressed, grabbed my laptop and the folder of trust documents, and headed to Mason's office long before my appointment time. When I walked into the building, he was already there, waiting for me, holding a cup of chamomile tea. "You look wired," he said, handing it over. "I am," I admitted. "But I'm also ready." "Good," he said. "Today is strategy day." We walked into the conference room, where the table was already covered with binders, sticky notes, highlighted timelines, printed emails, and diagrams of the money trail. Dr. Avery and Dr. Havers were waiting quietly, reviewing their notes. Mason gestured for me to sit. "Let's begin with the heart of everything, the trust." He pulled the Evelyn Hale Inheritance Trust binder forward. "This document," he said, tapping it, "is our anchor. And your parents violated every protective clause your grandmother put in place." He flipped open the binder, showing the section titled Beneficiary Rights. "Only you," he said. "Only your physical signature. No power of attorney amendments, no co-signers, no family exceptions. Your grandmother established this because she knew exactly who she was protecting you from." A slow breath escaped me. She did. "And because they ignored this," he continued, "every action they took becomes invalid and illegal." Dr. Avery leaned in. "And it gets better. The financial abuse we uncovered doesn't just strengthen your fraud case, it proves motive." She brought up the spreadsheets again. "This," she said, pointing to a cluster of red cells, "is the point where your parents realized they couldn't cover Paige's gambling debts anymore. Notice how the withdrawals from your account increased the same week the lender emails began." Then, she clicked to the next slide, a debt timeline cross-referenced with my travel dates. "They built their plan around your absence," she said. "They waited until you were gone. They timed the sale to avoid you entirely." I felt the familiar burn rise behind my ribs, not tears. Truth, sharp truth. And then Mason added, "They forged your signature because they knew you'd say no." A knock on the door interrupted us. "Come in," Mason called. His paralegal entered carrying a slim white envelope. "This came with the courier this morning," she said. "For Lauren." I frowned. "From who? No return address," she said. My chest tightened. Mason took it first, opened it carefully, then exhaled sharply and handed it to me. Inside was a single printed page. A transcript from the security footage. My mother's voice typed, verbatim, "Sign it, cleaner Page." Lauren signs her name tighter than that. My heart dropped. Tighter. She knew my signature so well she coached the forgery. Mason leaned forward. This is gold. Direct instruction. No ambiguity. Dr. Havers nodded. This alone proves intent. I swallowed hard, forcing air into my lungs. What next? Mason straightened. Next, we finalize our strategy for the emergency injunction. He clicked his tablet, showing a four-pronged plan. First, he began, we validate the trust. That's straightforward. Then we present the forged signature and Dr. Havers' analysis. Then we show the misrepresentation emails describing you as unstable, their pressure on the buyer's Jade statement. And the money trail, Dr. Avery added. Every unauthorized withdrawal. I nodded, absorbing it all like armor. And after the injunction, I asked. The full trial, Mason said. But let's get through step one. He paused, studying me. Before we continue, I need to ask something. I frowned. What haven't you told me yet? He asked quietly. A chill crawled up my neck. What do you mean? You look like someone carrying something heavier than the evidence, he said. Something personal. I hesitated. Then the truth slipped out. My parents don't see me, I said. They see a resource. Mason's expression softened, but his voice stayed steady. Then we prove legally and permanently that they no longer have access to that resource. I inhaled deeply. Okay. What else? At this stage, Mason said, we need your statement written out. Every detail you remember. Every conversation. Every request for money. Every moment that felt off. Why? Because emotional abuse patterns support motive. The court needs to see how long they've been conditioning you to stay quiet. Conditioning. The word hit me like a punch of clarity. I nodded. I'll start writing today. We moved on to the next part of the strategy, the subpoenas. We're calling the realtor, Mason said. She'll testify about your parents lying about your mental state. We're also subpoenaing the notary, Dr. Havers added. His negligence is key. Will he testify? I asked. He will, Mason said. He already confessed he didn't verify your ID. My stomach twisted. Because my mother vouched for me. Correct, he said. It shows collusion. Before I could respond, another knock sounded. This time, Jade entered, her eyes red-rimmed, a folder clutched tightly to her chest. I brought more, she said, voice shaky. She handed Mason the folder. Inside were printed voicemails from my parents. Do not call Lauren. She won't handle it. She's fragile. We're managing everything. Push the sale through. Quickly. I felt my jaw clench. Fragile. A word I'd heard too many times from them. A word used whenever I dared show emotion, whenever I set boundaries, whenever I said no. They weaponized your personality, Mason said. It's a common tactic in family fraud. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. What else? I asked. Jade hesitated. The buyers want to testify. They felt pressured. They said your parents' behavior was unsettling. Mason's eyebrows lifted. Excellent. After Jade left the room, felt heavier, stacked with evidence and truth. Then Dr. Avery said, there's something else. She rotated the screen toward me. A bank statement, not mine, my parents'. A series of payments nearly identical to a Nevada gambling attorney. This, she said, ties everything together. Their motive wasn't Paige alone. They were financially collapsing. My breath hitched. So they used me to save themselves. Yes, she replied. The truth settled low and cold inside me. Before I could speak, the conference phone rang. Mason answered, listened for a moment, then looked at me with that same hardened expression from yesterday. The notary submitted his official statement, he said. He admits he allowed Paige to sign while he looked away. The room fell silent. I pressed my knuckles against my lips. They thought I'd never find out. They thought you'd stay quiet, Mason corrected. But I'm not, I whispered. No, he said. You're not. We wrapped up strategy after that, subpoenas, filings, affidavits, timelines. My brain was overloaded, but my resolve felt razor sharp. By the time I stepped out onto Mason's balcony for a breath of cold Seattle air, The sun was low, casting sharp streaks of light through the clouds. I closed my eyes. My grandmother's voice came back to me like a memory pulled from warm water. You were never meant to be small, Lauren. You only learned to make yourself that way. When I walked back inside, the team was packing up. Mason met my eyes. Tomorrow we file everything. I nodded. And then he said, your family learns what truth feels like. I stood there for a moment, staring at the stacks of evidence on the table, every line, every signature, every dollar stolen. They had built a trap for me, but they were the ones caught in it now. And I was done being their silence. The courthouse steps felt colder than the air around them, like they were waiting for the weight of something heavy to unfold. I climbed slowly, one hand wrapped around my travel mug of chamomile tea, the warmth seeping into my fingers but not reaching the place in my chest that felt tight and hollow. Mason walked beside me, steady as ever, holding the thick binder labeled Hale v. Hale Injunction Hearing. Inside, the courthouse lobby buzzed with the subdued murmurs of early morning hearings. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The scent of old paper, disinfectant, and wet coats filled the air. I pressed my shoulder blades back, breathed in, and reminded myself, this time they don't control the room. Mason leaned slightly toward me. Stay silent. Stay steady. Let them unravel themselves. I nodded. But nothing prepared me for the sight waiting outside the courtroom. My mother was pacing with frantic energy, her eyes red, her tissue crumpled in her fist. My father stood beside her like a block of ice, rigid, stiff jaw ticking. And Paige was slumped against the wall, arms crossed, hair a tangled mess, her expression bouncing between fear and hate, like she couldn't choose which one to lean into. The moment my mother saw me, she lunged forward. Lauren, we need to talk. Mason's arm shot out. No, you do not speak to my client. Paige rolled her eyes dramatically. God, Lauren. You really hired muscle to hide behind. I met her gaze with a calmness I didn't know I had. I hired someone because you forged my name. Her face twitched, and for the first time she didn't have a comeback. My father stepped forward, face flushed with anger. You're destroying this family. No, I said quietly. I'm exposing what you did. Before he could answer, the bailiff opened the courtroom door and called out, Case Coleman versus Hale. Parties may enter. We filed inside. The courtroom was colder than the hallway, and larger. The ceiling soared overhead, the judge's bench looming like a wall carved from authority itself. Judge Mara Kensington already sat at the bench, silver hair, sharp blue eyes, posture as straight as a blade. We stood. She nodded. We sat. Mason rose first, binder in hand. Your Honor, he began. My client seeks an emergency injunction due to fraudulent actions taken by the defendants. Specifically, the unauthorized sale of her protected property, forged signatures, misrepresentation of her mental state, and intentional withholding of information. His voice was steady, controlled, deadly. He slid 3 folders onto the clerk's desk: trust violation, forgery, evidence, misrepresentation. The judge flipped through them with the focus of someone who had no patience for nonsense. Then the defense attorney, Neil Bradford, stood. He looked far too young and far too outmatched. Your Honor, he started nervously, this situation is a family misunderstanding. Emotions ran high. Mistakes were made. Judge Kensington lifted her hand. He froze. Her voice was cool as ice. Did your clients forge their daughter's signature? Bradford blinked rapidly. Well, the nature of the did they, she repeated, eyes narrowing. A long, painful silence. He swallowed hard. Your Honor, the signature was not verified, which means it was invalid, she snapped. Sit down, Mr. Bradford. The defense attorney sank into his chair like a deflated balloon. I glanced at my family. My mother's mouth hung open, my father's fist clenched. Paige stared forward as if she could will herself invisible. Mason continued. Your Honor, we are requesting that all funds from the illegal sale be frozen immediately. The trust document clearly states that the penthouse cannot be sold, transferred, or altered without Miss Hale's express consent. He projected the trust clause onto the screen beside the bench. Judge Kensington nodded, slowly impressed. This language is airtight. Mason pressed on. Additionally, the defendants told the buyers that Miss Hale was mentally unstable, therefore unable to handle legal matters. We have emails confirming this. Judge Kensington's eyebrows snapped upward. Is this true? She asked Bradford, without looking at him. Bradford's voice cracked. Your Honor, they believed that, she said sharply, is not what I asked. He fell silent again. Mason wasn't done. The buyers are willing to testify. The realtor has already submitted evidence showing the defendants pressured her to exclude Lauren entirely. The judge flipped a page, jaw tightening. Remarkably irresponsible. A small cold satisfaction flared inside me. They were finally being seen for who they were, not who they told everyone they were. Then Judge Kensington leaned back. Miss Hale, she said, do you wish to say anything before I rule? I stood, legs surprisingly steady. Only that I never agreed to this. They lied. They stole my home while I was away, and then they told strangers that I was unstable to justify it. I'm not unstable. I'm angry. The judge nodded once. Understood. She turned to the stack of documents and began reviewing them again. Each page turn echoed like a countdown. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Finally, she closed the folder. Given the evidence presented, she said, voice ringing through the room, the court grants the emergency injunction. My mother gasped sharply. All accounts connected to the sale are hereby frozen, the judge continued, effective immediately. No transfers, no withdrawals, no access by any party until the full hearing. My father lurched to his feet. Your Honor, this will ruin us. Sit down, she ordered. You committed fraud. Actions have consequences. He dropped back into his seat. Paige whispered something. I couldn't hear, something that sounded like a curse. My mother looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. Lauren, please, I didn't respond. The judge banged her gavel. Full hearing will occur within 30 days. Court is adjourned. Chaos erupted instantly. My mother lunged toward me. How could you do this? We needed that money. I stepped back. You didn't need it, I said. You stole it. Paige shoved her way forward. You think this makes you strong? You look pathetic. I met her glare without blinking. And you look guilty. Her face twisted. My father's voice was low and venomous. We'll fight this. I know, I replied. But for once, I'm fighting back. Mason guided me toward the door while my family's voices spiraled into something wild behind us, accusations, crying, denial, rage. But none of it belonged to me anymore. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a baptism. Clean, sharp, real. Mason placed a hand on my shoulder. You did well in there. I didn't do anything, I said. Yes, he replied. You stood your ground. We walked down the courthouse steps slowly. And for the first time since stepping off that plane from the Caribbean, I felt something loosen in my chest, something like breath, something like strength, something like the smallest beginning of freedom. The injunction was just the first battle, but it was a win, and that win tasted like justice. The morning of the full trial felt heavier than any day before it. I woke in the motel before the alarm, staring at the cracked ceiling while the heater buzzed inconsistently in the corner. It wasn't fear, keeping my eyes open, it was anticipation, thick and electric, like the moment before a storm touches down. Today, everything my family did would be laid out under fluorescent lights and sworn oaths. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long minute, grounding myself. Today, I whispered, the truth speaks louder than they ever did. When I stepped outside, the air bit cold against my skin. Mason picked me up in his car, 2 enormous binders sitting in the back seat labeled fraud evidence and financial abuse and misrepresentation. You ready? He asked, pulling out into traffic. I nodded. Ready to see them finally held accountable. The courthouse was busier than last time, more people, more whispers. The story had spread faster than I expected. Words drifted past as we walked forged signature, gambling debts, trust violation, none of them wrong. Inside the courtroom, everything felt bigger. The ceiling arched higher, the lighting brighter, the gallery fuller. A jury sat in 2 rows already watching us as we approached our table. My stomach tightened, but I kept my chin high. My parents entered a few minutes later separately. My mother looked small, swallowed by a beige sweater and stiff posture. My father looked worn down, his anger muted by exhaustion. Paige trailed behind them, eyes red, hair pulled into a messy knot that made her look far younger than she was. They didn't speak to each other. They barely looked at each other. For once, they weren't unified. The bailiff called the courtroom to order as Judge Kensington entered. She scanned the room with calm authority and began. This is the full hearing on the claims of fraud, misrepresentation, trust violation, and identity misuse. Mason stood for the opening statement. Your Honor, the evidence will show that my client's parents and sister orchestrated a deliberate, coordinated plan to illegally sell her penthouse, a protected trust asset, while she was out of state. They forged her signature, misrepresented her mental state, siphoned money from her accounts, and deliberately excluded her to cover escalating gambling debts. He paused, letting the words land like heavy stones. This is not a family misunderstanding. This is premeditated fraud. Bradford rose slowly on the defense side, voice shaky. Your Honor, the defendants acted out of desperation and love. They believed no, Mason said, cutting in. They believed she would say no. So they erased her. Judge Kensington raised a hand. We will hear the evidence. And so it began. The buyers were called, first Michael and Dana. They walked to the stand looking equal parts nervous and relieved. Michael testified. We were told Lauren was emotionally unstable. Her parents said she couldn't handle the pressure of a sale. Dana added, they insisted we not contact her. We thought it was strange. Mason projected an email onto the courtroom screen. It was from my mother. Do not attempt to reach Lauren. Stress could trigger another episode. We are handling everything. I heard jurors murmur under their breath. My mother buried her face in her hands. Next came Jade, the realtor. She looked pale but determined. They pressured me to rush the sale, she said, voice trembling. They kept saying Lauren wouldn't understand the urgency. When I asked for her contact information, they snapped at me. They said it would agitate her. And did you believe them? Mason asked gently. I did, Jade admitted. But after seeing the footage and the forged signature, I realized I'd been manipulated. The jury scribbled notes quickly. Then came the notary, Mr. Dalton. His voice cracked as he spoke. I didn't verify Lauren's ID. They said she was too unstable to be present. They pressured me to proceed. Judge Kensington leaned forward sharply. You knowingly notarized a signature without verification. He nodded miserably. Yes, Your Honor. A ripple of disbelief passed through the room. Then came the moment that felt like the dam breaking. Dr. Havers, the forensic document specialist, stepped up with enlarged images of my real signature next to the forged one. These hesitation lines, he explained, pointing with a metal tool, indicate tracing. This signature was not written naturally. It was drawn. And to be clear, Mason asked, was this signature written by Lauren Hale? No, Dr. Havers said without hesitation. It is a forgery. I didn't look at Paige. I didn't need to her. Silence was loud enough. Then Dr. Avery took the stand, walking the court through the money trail with the calm intensity of someone presenting a crime scene. Here, she said, zooming in on the screen, are 12 months of unauthorized withdrawals from Miss Hale's accounts. Then, we see payments toward gambling platforms, 2 predatory lenders, and a Nevada debt negotiation attorney. She clicked to another timeline. This was not accidental. This was systematic financial abuse. My mother looked like she might faint. My father stared at the table. Paige chewed at her lip until it bled. And then, just when I thought things couldn't sink deeper, Mason pulled out an email printed on crisp white paper. Exhibit 47, he said. An email from Richard Hale to a creditor. He read it aloud. Funds guaranteed. Selling daughter's penthouse while she's traveling. We'll pay off balances upon closing. The room went silent. Not a rustle, not a cough. My father closed his eyes. Mason turned toward the defense. Premeditation. In writing. Next came the defense's turn. My mother cried the moment she sat in the witness chair. Loudly. Dramatically. I didn't mean to hurt her, she sobbed. We were saving Paige. Lauren has always been strong. She doesn't need Judge Kensington raised a hand. Mrs. Hale. Answer only the questions. Paige went next. She shook as she spoke. I didn't want to sign her name, she whispered. Mom told me to. Dad said it was the only way. And did you understand that you were forging a legal document? Mason asked calmly. Paige's chin wobbled. I thought we were doing what we had to. And you believed you deserved her home, Mason pressed. Her eyes filled. I just wanted one thing. She always had everything. It was jealousy raw and unfiltered. Richard testified last. Angry, defensive. She owed us, he snapped. We're her parents. Family shares. The judge didn't hide her disgust. Family does not justify fraud. After the last witness stepped down, the judge called for closing statements. Mason spoke simply. They didn't make a mistake. They made a choice. Bradford tried to claim family stress and misguided love, but even he sounded unconvinced. When the judge adjourned for the day, my legs shook. Not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of what had unfolded. I stepped outside into the corridor, leaning briefly against the cool wall. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Paige. If you think this ends in court, you're wrong. I stared at the screen, my heart beat steady. Of course she wasn't finished. But neither was I. I left the courthouse with Mason beside me, but my mind stayed trapped inside that fluorescent-lit room, inside the testimony, the lies unraveling, the gasps from the gallery when the forged signature flashed across the screen. Even after everything we'd shown, everything we'd proven, part of me still braced for someone to tap my shoulder and say it wasn't real, that none of this could possibly be happening in my family. But the cold air outside grounded me, and the sound of jurors murmuring as they exited reminded me this was very real, and it wasn't over. When I got back to the motel, exhaustion swept over me so quickly it nearly buckled my knees. I kicked off my shoes, dropped the trial binder on the desk, and collapsed onto the bed. The cheap blanket scratched my skin, the mattress springs creaked under my weight, but the discomfort barely registered. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment before I dragged myself up and opened my laptop. I needed clarity. I needed to re-examine everything before tomorrow. My notes, the trust documents, the screenshots. I was halfway through rereading Dr. Avery's financial timeline when my phone buzzed. One new message. From a number I didn't recognize. Stop this, Lauren. You're tearing our family apart. I closed my eyes. My mother. It sounded exactly like her. I didn't answer. Another text came seconds later. Think about your future. Think about inheritance. Inheritance. The word tasted like ash. Then a third. If you do this, you'll regret it. I pressed delete. But the buzzing didn't stop. Another number. You're destroying Paige. She'll never recover from this. Then a voicemail from a blocked ID. My father's voice, tight and furious, barely controlled. Lauren, this has gone far enough. You're humiliating us. You're humiliating yourself. Fix this before it's too late. I set the phone face down. The room was silent except for the hum of the old heater, but inside my chest everything felt loud and tight. A knock jolted me off the bed. 3 sharp taps. Urgent. I froze. No one should know where I was staying. Mason specifically told me not to share the location. Another knock. Lauren, it's the front desk. I exhaled and opened the door a crack. The night clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a navy polo, held an envelope. This was left for you, she said. Someone dropped it at the counter 5 minutes ago. Who? She shrugged. I didn't catch a name. That chilled me more than anything else tonight. I thanked her, shut the door, and sat on the bed with the envelope in my lap. The paper was thick, stiff. My name was written in looping handwriting, not my mother's, not my father's. Pages. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. You really think you're better than us. You think you deserve everything. You're not special. You're not even strong. And you're not going to win, no signature. But I didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakable, big rounded loops the same way she used to write her name on her school notebooks. I folded the paper once and slid it into the trial binder. Evidence. Mason's voice echoed in my head. Let them expose themselves. I changed out of my courtroom clothes and into sweatpants, splashed water on my face, and sat at the desk. I forced myself to finish reviewing the financial exhibits, pausing only to annotate or add questions. But every time my eyes drifted, they landed on the envelope. Paige's voice matched the text message she'd sent earlier in the day. It matched the bitterness she showed at the hearing. It matched the entitlement she'd grown up fed. And under it all was a deeper message, one she didn't know she'd revealed. She was scared. Deeply, desperately scared. Around midnight, the motel walls felt too tight, so I pulled on a hoodie and stepped outside. The parking lot was dim, illuminated by 2 flickering lamps. The sky was low and cloudy, the air wet with coming rain. I walked a slow circle around the building, letting myself breathe. When I crossed the back lot, the shadows shifted. Someone was standing near the dumpsters. My heart lurched. He stepped forward into the faint light. A tall man in a gray beanie dark jacket. Maybe 30, maybe 40. Stiff posture, unfamiliar, and too still. We stared at each other for a moment too long. Then he turned and walked off into the darkness. I swallowed hard, backing toward the side door. Coincidence, maybe. But after the messages, the threats, the envelope, my instincts buzzed, warning me. Someone was following the case too closely. When I returned to my room, I triple-locked the door. The phone buzzed again at 1:30 in the morning. This time it wasn't a threat, it was Mason. Don't panic, new evidence just came in. You need to see it first thing in the morning. It changes everything. I sat up straight. What kind of evidence? I texted back, he replied almost immediately. A recording. Someone submitted it anonymously. And it shows intent more clearly than anything we've seen so far. My pulse kicked up. Who's on the recording? I typed. A pause. Then your parents. Paige. All 3. At the notary's office. Planning everything. I stared at the message as if it might rewrite itself. It didn't. This was the missing piece, the part we hadn't had. The before. The recorded motive. Someone must have leaked the rest of the security footage. Someone who wanted to help, or someone who wanted to save themselves. Either way, it was a gift. But a dangerous one. I turned off the light and crawled into bed, but sleep didn't come. My mind kept replaying Mason's words. A recording. Planning everything. My parents' voices. Paige's voice. Casual. Confident. Conspiratorial. And tomorrow, it would become public. Around 4 in the morning, exhaustion finally dragged me under. But even then, my dreams were filled with fragments, Paige's taunting handwriting, Judge Kensington's steady eyes, the man in the beanie, the recorded voices I hadn't yet heard. And when the alarm finally blared at 7, I woke up with one thought carved into my mind. Tomorrow's hearing wasn't just about proving what they did. It was about revealing who they truly were. And once that recording played, there would be no going back. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until I stepped inside Mason's office the next morning and saw the look on his face, focused, severe, sharpened in a way I hadn't seen before. He didn't greet me with his usual dry humor or a half-smile. He simply motioned toward the conference room. "They're already here," he said. "Who?" I asked, following him inside. But the moment the door swung open, I understood. Dr. Avery sat at the table laptop, open fingers poised above the keyboard like she'd frozen mid-thought. Dr. Havers was organizing a stack of printed frames. and on the screen mounted to the wall was a still image, a paused surveillance video. I recognized the cheap laminate flooring, the beige walls, the counter with the small flag, the notary's office. My stomach tightened. "You need to see the full recording," Mason said quietly. "This changes everything." He hit play. The footage began with the notary stepping out for a moment. The camera angle caught the room from above, slightly tilted, and then the door opened again. My mother entered first, holding her purse like a weapon. My father followed, his posture tense. Paige came in last, chewing at her thumbnail, glancing nervously at the door. The audio was faint, but clear enough. My mother's voice came through first. "Okay, we need to do this quickly. The notary trusts us. He won't question it." My father lowered himself into the chair. "Just sign it cleanly. No hesitation." Paige sat down slowly. I don't know if I can make it look exact." "You practiced," my mother snapped. "And stop acting scared. Lauren isn't supposed to know anything." Paige fiddled with the pen. "What if she finds out?" "She won't," my father said. "And even if she does, she's too emotional to do anything about it." My throat constricted. My mother leaned over Paige. "Tighter loop on the L. She always curves it tighter." Paige let out a tiny shaky laugh. "Yeah, because she's uptight." My mother smirked. "Exactly. Now sign." I felt my hands begin to tremble. Paige bent over the document, pen shaking for a second before she steadied it. My father tapped the table impatiently. My mother kept whispering instructions. "Good. Now the E. No, that's too loose. Do it again." They made her redo it. Not once, but 4 times. Frame by frame, Dr. Haver's screenshots matched the final forgery we'd built the case around. When the signature was finally deemed close enough, my father exhaled with satisfaction. "Done. The sale will go through before she's even back on the mainland." Paige bit her lip. "Should we feel bad?" My mother scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. She doesn't need that penthouse. Paige needs help. Family takes care of each other. And Lauren will understand," my father said. Eventually, the notary re-entered, then oblivious, smiling like he had no idea a crime had unfolded while he stepped into the next room. Mason stopped the video. No one spoke, not for several seconds. Finally, Dr. Avery broke the silence. "This isn't just fraud. This is conspiracy. Coordinated conspiracy." My voice came out low and unsteady. "Someone recorded the whole thing." Mason nodded. "An employee saw your parents arguing with the notary later that day. They suspected something and pulled the footage." "And they sent it anonymously?" I asked. "Yes," Mason said, "probably out of fear of retaliation. But they saved the original time-stamped file." I sank into the nearest chair. "This is everything." "It is," he said. "And it will destroy whatever defense they thought they had." Before anyone could continue, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I glanced at the screen. Dad, 3 missed calls. Mom, 8 messages. Paige voicemail. Then another message popped up. "You need to come home now. We can fix this if you just stop." Another, "Lauren, please, don't go to court today. It will ruin us." Another, "You're turning everyone against us. Lawyers, judges, strangers. S-top." And then Paige's message, "You promised you'd always have my back." Guess that was a lie, just like you. I locked the screen. "They're spiraling," Mason said, "and that means today might get ugly." "Good," I said quietly. "Let them feel a fraction of what they put me through." He nodded. "Ready to go, as ready as I'll ever be." We arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early, but my parents were already there. My mother rushed toward me the moment she saw us. Lauren, please listen to me." I held up a hand. "Don't." She stopped, tears brimming. Genuine or performative, I couldn't tell anymore. My father stepped forward. "You don't understand how this will affect us. Our home, our accounts, they're frozen. We can't." "You should have thought about that before forging my name," I said. Paige stood behind them. arms crossed, face pale and blotchy. She didn't speak, but the fury in her eyes was unmistakable. Judge Kensington entered the courtroom exactly at 9. Everyone rose. We sat. She looked down at the bench, tapping a pen lightly as she spoke. We will continue the fraud hearing. Plaintiff, you may proceed with new evidence. Mason stood. Your Honor, yesterday, an anonymous witness submitted security footage taken at the notary office. It shows the defendants conspiring to forge Miss Hale's signature. The judge's eyes sharpened. Let me see it. Mason handed a USB to the clerk. The screen illuminated, and the room fell into absolute silence. Watching the footage yesterday had been devastating. Watching it again in the courtroom while my family sat only feet from me was a different kind of ache. My mother's face drained of all color as her own voice echoed through the speakers. Paige wiped her nose, tears leaking despite her clenched jaw. My father stared straight ahead, unblinking, as if hoping he could pretend he wasn't the man on the screen, instructing his daughter how to perfect a forgery. When the video ended, Judge Kensington leaned back in her chair, jaw set. Mr. Bradford, she said coolly, do your clients wish to explain this? The defense attorney looked like he wanted to disappear. Your Honor, the defendants were under emotional distress. Fraud, conducted calmly and step by step, is not emotional distress, the judge snapped. It is intent, deliberate intent. My mother broke then. She burst into tears, loud, uncontrolled sobs that echoed through the wooden chamber. Your Honor, we didn't think it wasn't supposed to go this far. Judge Kensington said, incredulous. Ma'am, you forged your daughter's legal identity. You lied to financial institutions. You misrepresented her to buyers. You committed multiple felonies. And you want me to believe you didn't think it would go this far? My mother covered her face. Paige stepped forward, suddenly, voice shaking. It was my fault. I signed it. I thought Lauren didn't care about the penthouse. She never invites me over. She never. Judge Kensington held up a hand. Sit down, Miss Hale. Your jealousy is not a legal defense. Paige froze, then sank back into her chair like a collapsing structure. My father finally spoke, voice low. We didn't have a choice. You had many choices, Judge Kensington said. You simply didn't like any of them. The courtroom crackled with tension. Mason stood again. Your Honor, at this point we request an immediate decision. The evidence is overwhelming. The judge nodded slowly. I will review all exhibits one final time before ruling. She rose. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 10 for the verdict. The gavel struck. As soon as the echo faded, my father looked at me, desperate, hollow. You've destroyed us, he whispered. I met his gaze without flinching. No, I said softly. You did that yourselves. My mother sobbed harder. Paige glared like she wanted to tear through me. But none of it mattered anymore. Because tomorrow, everything would end. And everything would begin. The courthouse felt different the morning of the verdict, quieter, more focused, as if the walls themselves understood something final was about to happen. I arrived early, sitting on one of the long wooden benches outside the courtroom, with my hands folded in my lap. I don't know how long I sat there before Mason appeared beside me holding 2 coffees. You'll want this, he said, handing one over. Not for the caffeine, for the warmth. I wrapped my fingers around the cup, grateful for something to anchor me. Thank you. He studied me for a moment. You ready? I nodded, though. Readiness felt like a strange word. It wasn't nerves anymore. It wasn't fear. It was something steadier. Acceptance, maybe. Closure lingering at the edges. When the bailiff opened the doors, we stepped inside. The jury filed in moments later, their expressions unreadable. The gallery filled 2 lawyers, clerks, curious locals who had followed the case, all whispering as my parents entered. My mother looked as if she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes swollen. My father was stiff, jaw clenched so tightly I could see it pulsing. Paige walked in last, her gaze downcast, her movements small, like she was trying to shrink into the floor. I didn't look away. This was the end. Judge Kensington entered, and the room rose, When she sat, silence blanketed the space. "Jury," she said, turning to them. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman with graying curls and steady eyes, stood. "We have, your honor." My breath held. In the matter of fraud, the foreperson read, "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Lauren Hale." A sharp inhale rippled through the gallery. My mother let out a soft, broken sound. In the matter of forgery, the foreperson continued, "We find in favor of the plaintiff." Paige covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. "In the matter of trust violation and misappropriation of assets, we find in favor of the plaintiff." My father's face hollowed. "And in the matter of emotional harm and intentional misrepresentation," the foreperson said, glancing briefly at my mother, "we find in favor of the plaintiff." The courtroom exhaled all at once. Judge Kensington nodded, then turned her attention directly to my family. "This court finds that the defendants engaged in deliberate, coordinated actions to deprive the plaintiff of her property, her finances, and her autonomy. Such actions were not momentary lapses of judgment. They were intentional." My mother burst into tears, loud and desperate. "Please," she whispered. "Please." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Hale, you will remain silent." I watched as my parents shrank under her gaze. "The sale of the Penthouse is declared null and void," the judge continued. "Ownership is restored to Miss Hale effective immediately." My heart clenched, relief and sorrow tangled in one breath. Furthermore, the judge said, "All funds withdrawn fraudulently from the plaintiff's accounts must be repaid in full. Additional damages totaling $100,000 are granted to the plaintiff for emotional harm, legal fees, and loss of use." My mother sobbed harder. Paige stared at me like I'd set her world on fire. My father finally broke his voice, a gravelly whisper. "We can't pay that." Judge Kensington didn't soften. "The ability to pay does not excuse criminal behavior." She looked at me, then her expression shifting, still stern but gentler in a way. "Miss Hale," she said, "I hope this verdict brings you closure and the freedom to rebuild without interference." I swallowed hard. "Thank you, Your Honor." The gavel struck. Court was adjourned. Everything after happened in slow motion. My mother tried to reach for me. "Lauren, please, don't do this. We're your family." I stepped back. "You stopped being my family when you decided my life was yours to take." Paige rushed forward. "I'll go to jail because of you. Because you didn't let us fix this quietly. You didn't want to fix anything I said. You wanted to avoid consequences." My father stared at me, expression twisted. "We gave you everything." "No," I said softly. "You took everything." Their lawyer tried to guide them out as they unraveled, crying, arguing, blaming each other, but none of it touched me anymore. I watched them leave the courtroom in a tangle of regret and denial, and for the first time since this began, the air around me felt clean. Mason exhaled beside me. "It's over." I nodded. "It's over." He placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Let's get your keys back." We left the courthouse, sunlight breaking through gray clouds like a quiet victory. Outside, the world looked the same, but I wasn't. 2 days later, a moving truck pulled into the driveway of my penthouse building. The moment I stepped out of the elevator and into my home again, it felt surreal, like stepping back into a part of myself I'd been forced to abandon. The windows stretched across the skyline, the river shimmering in the distance. My bookshelves stood exactly as I left them. The scent of bergamot candles lingered faintly, a ghost of my old routine. It was mine again. All of it. As the movers unpacked boxes, I walked through the rooms, slowly touching surfaces, grounding myself. The space didn't just feel like a home, it felt like a reclamation. But the strangest part wasn't anger or victory. It was peace. A few hours later, I stood on the balcony with a cup of tea. The sun dipped low, painting Seattle in warm gold. For the first time in months, the silence felt kind. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, but I recognized the tone immediately. "I hope you're okay." My mother. I didn't reply. Maybe one day I would. Maybe I never would. Healing wasn't linear, and forgiveness wasn't owed. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about me. It was about remembering that boundaries are not betrayals. That protecting myself was not cruelty. That choosing peace was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do. I leaned back in the balcony chair, breathed in the cool evening air, and let the chapter close fully in my heart. And as much as I'd lost along the way, I'd gained something more important myself. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to take advantage of your kindness? How did it change you? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength or boundaries, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. There are more stories coming, stories of betrayal, revenge, redemption, and the quiet triumphs that reshape us. Thank you for being here. Here's to standing tall even when the people who should lift you up try to break you.